Oh, we are. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Um, I'm hosting Ms. Camila Villanueva today, and she's going to be talking to us about Sankofa and the power of personal narratives. And she is an upper school Spanish teacher in Washington, D.C., but she's joining us from Lima in Peru today. Camila, it's so nice to have you. You can take it on.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to get started. My name is Camila Villanueva, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about what it is that I do and how I got there. So let's just get started. Okay, so like they said, I'm teaching currently in a high school in Washington, D.C., and I teach Spanish. I teach mainly grammar classes, and then I also teach what they call an advanced seminar, which is sort of the equivalent of what an AP class would be. And I can talk a little bit more about that further up. But basically, the essence for me is that I really like teaching, because for me, especially teaching languages, I feel like language, you can't teach it in a vacuum, so it's more like a medium to teach whatever it is you want at any level. So it doesn't matter if you're teaching Spanish 1 or the most advanced classes, you can always bring in issues of identity, you can always bring in culture, you can always bring in politics, and you can always tailor it to the right level. And so I think my favorite thing about teaching languages is the fact that it's a medium that you can use to teach anything you want. So I'll explain a little bit more about how I got here in a little bit. But first I wanted to get to the main issue of my presentation. So for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of Sankofa, Sankofa is something that I came across when I was in college and I was taking a dance class, and my professor would always tell us that every single move that we did had a name, and the movements represented what the meanings behind these names were. And Sankofa is one that really stuck with me. And so if you can see on the screen, it basically says that there's different variations, but the one that he taught us was saying how if you take your arm, I don't know if you can see, and you like trace an S towards your body and then you push through it afterwards, that's one of the ways that you can represent Sankofa. And what it means, loosely, the way he explained it, was that you need to look to where you came from in order to know where you're going. And that really stuck with me, especially the way that he explained it, saying that in life, a lot of things happen. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. But whenever you feel lost and whenever you're not really sure about what to do or why things are happening, you, instead of trying to just ask blindly, you should always look to where you came from. And if you look behind, look to your family, look to your other experiences, harnessing your past will always help you understand your present. And so that's something that really resonated with me, and I've applied it to, I try to apply it to most of my classes and just life in general, but certainly this seminar, which I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so the concept, like I said, is the idea that you have to understand the past in order to be able to interpret the present and to project yourself in the future. And so Nikki Giovanni is a poet that I really like. And so there's a lot of quotes. Once I heard about Sankofa, I realized that there's Sankofa signs everywhere and that a lot of people are talking about it in different terms. And so this one quote from Nikki Giovanni is one that I really like. The idea that today, whether it's in society, whether it's in your family or your community or your high school or your job or just in general, if you're trying to understand how things are going or why things are working the way they are, you can't really understand others if you don't understand yourself first. And so that's the essence of what I try to teach my students in this seminar. The idea that you have to really know about yourself and why you think the way you think and where these things came from so that you can sort of start to understand the way other people process things as well. And so one of the main assignments I give my students in this advanced seminar is in first semester, they each have to present their personal narrative. So they have to stand up and for about 10 to 15 minutes, talk to us about who they are. And that can be very different for different people. The only guidelines that I give them are, it has to be a presentation that by the end of the presentation, it's very clear that nobody else could have done it. It has to be very you. And so some people talk about race, some people talk about ethnicity, other people talk about sports or their family or their pets or their summers. The way they organize the material is entirely up to them, but we're trying to get an idea of who they are. And so one rule that I have in my seminar is that I never ask my students to do anything that I'm not willing to do myself first. And so I will get started and give you guys like a condensed version of the narrative that I tell my students before they start presenting theirs throughout the year. So for me, dance is probably my first love. It's something that when I was younger, my parents wanted me to have an extracurricular activity. So they tried swimming, they tried piano, they tried all these different things, tennis, and none of them really stuck. And then one day they tried ballet, and they took me to this ballet class in this school. And it was a really small school. It was it felt like a family. And I loved it from the first day. And then I ended up sticking with ballet for about 10, 15 years. And it's definitely something that shaped who I am now. It's something that taught me discipline. It's something that taught me to value hard work, because you have to practice every single day. And it was interesting how even after 10 years of doing it, for spring break, I would stop doing ballet for 1 week. And then when I would go back, I would feel like I was a beginner again, because it was just, I couldn't believe how fast your body stopped remembering certain things and how much you really had to drill day after day after day. And so I remember writing about this in my college essay. And so I would say, colleges, when you're applying for undergrad, that's definitely the time where you want to use those personal essays to tell the people who are reading it who you are, because everything else they see in your application are numbers. They see transcripts, they see grades, they see test scores. Your essay is the one time that they can hear your voice. And so I would definitely recommend writing about something that really matters to you. And I remember I wrote about the fact that I'm very shy, but I love to dance. And so my whole essay was about how I love dancing on stage, because when I'm on stage, I feel like the lights that are shining onto your face make it so that you really can't see the audience. So I feel like when I'm on stage, I'm by myself, so I'm not shy, but I know that people are watching. And so it's like that interesting combination that was something that I took that as an example and then started talking about how I can apply that to different parts in my life. So I definitely what like speaks to you and around that later on. But moving on, students a little bit about myself. And so this slide basically represents a lot of my interests and a lot of my non-interests. If you look at the top left, cheese, I can eat a lot of cheese. I love cheese. There's like nothing cheese can't fix as far as I'm concerned. On the bottom left, pigs are my favorite animal. And so I don't eat pork. I haven't eaten pork since I was 9. And everyone always assumes that it's for religious reasons, but it's because when I was 9, I saw Winnie the Pooh and I saw Piglet, and I decided that they were too cute to ever eat again. And so I just stopped eating pork overnight. Unfortunately, I'm not good at cooking, so that's what the other image represents. Again, like I'm very shy, and I like lounging because when I'm at work, I'm moving around a lot, I'm planning, I'm constantly on the go. So when I have alone time, very much so my friends are saying that a sloth is like my spirit animal. Sometimes I can be grumpy, like and then I really don't like spiders. A little higher on the prairie. Those are important to me because when I was younger, my mom used to read to me every single night. And I think that that's where my love of stories came from. And so every single night we would read a chapter. If there were words I didn't understand, we would look them up together in the dictionary. We would talk about them. We would wonder like what would happen in the next chapter. And so reading that entire series with my mom is probably one of the earliest memories I have. And I think that she really, whether she knew it or not, played a really big role in showing me that stories are really important and that they matter. I also grew up playing cards. I play cards with my grandmother, especially my mom's mom. She taught us all how to play all these different card games, and so that's a really important thing in my life now. Jacks, I don't know if people really still play jacks, but I used to play that in Peru with my friends sometimes. On the top right, people always make fun of a very strong obsession with Korean dramas. And I found that sometimes in Korean dramas, Sankofa is there too. So the quote that I picked from one of the dramas that I saw, it's in Spanish, but it basically says one of the characters is saying how they're going to go on this trip and they don't really know what's going to happen next, that the earth is round. So it doesn't really matter how far you go, you always end up back where you started. And I thought that that was brilliant. And so that's my guilty pleasure. So I always watch those. And then on the bottom right, dance is my first love, but I would say my dog was my second love. We got him when I was around 12. And he was just very important to me. And so we used to celebrate all his birthdays. And I remember there was like no better feeling than coming home and like seeing him wag his tail and come up to me. And so he passed away after he turned 16. And it was very difficult for me, but I'm really grateful for the relationship that I was able to form with a pet. And I don't know, for those of you who have pets, you might be able to relate. Some people don't like animals, but for me, that was something that really stuck with me. Moving on. So my family's from Peru. And so in these slides, whenever you see any quotes that are in dark black, like in bold letters, like the ones up here that you see on the screen, when I was in college, I wrote my thesis on the role of language and cultural identity with regard to the children of immigrants in the United States. And so they let me combine research with my personal experience. So I've always been trying to bring in my own story, my own personal narrative into everything that I do. And so anything that you see that's written in bold on these slides are excerpts from my thesis. And so my family's from Peru, and that's a very important defining characteristic of mine. My parents, their jobs had these fantastic benefits where they would pay for our family to go back to Peru every year. And so I've been really lucky in that even though I grew up very far apart from a lot of my family, the fact that I could see them every year helped us create very strong connections and very strong bonds, especially with my grandparents, because my cousins, they've been able to travel to the US and I've been able to see them during other times. But for my grandparents, really the one time that I would see them would be during Christmas. And the bottom left, those are my dad's parents. And then the two on the right are my mom's parents. And so pictures of each of them. And they were all very important people in my life. Some of them I only knew for a short amount of time. My dad's father passed away when I was very young, when I was 6, but I still have very fond memories of going to his house and him giving us cookies and then telling us stories about all these inventions he used to do. I had a very, very strong connection with my mom's mom, and she passed away in 2000. My dad's mom passed away. And then my grandfather, my mom's father, he and I became very close probably around, I would say maybe like 7 years ago, because he was always very busy working. And then once I started coming back to Peru and my other grandparents had passed away and he was also retired, he would spend more time talking to me and I would ask him, tell me about how you met my grandmother. Tell me about your first date. Tell me about things that you really liked. And it was one of the most, I think it's been one of the best experiences that I've had, because I wasn't able to do that with any of my other grandparents, not because I didn't want to, but I was too young. And so I really appreciated the connection that I was able to form with my mom's father. And it also made me realize that on the one hand, I wish that I'd had the opportunity to do that with all my grandparents, but on the other hand, I'm glad that I was able to have it even with one, because it showed me the value of conversation and showed me the value of asking questions. And my mom's dad, unfortunately, passed away earlier this week. So it's been a difficult year, but I'm really happy that I was able to be here in Peru with him and talk to him and like tell him that I loved him. And I'm always going to be incredibly, incredibly grateful for everything that my grandparents taught me. And of course, my parents. The picture on the right is them on their wedding day. And the picture on the left is my parents around 30 years later, 25 to 30 years later. And I love these two pictures because I feel like in these pictures, you can tell that nothing has really changed between them in over 30 years. And their relationship has meant the world to me. I feel incredibly lucky to have had an example of what a healthy marriage looks like. And I always tell my students, healthy marriage is not the same thing as a perfect marriage. There's no such thing as perfection. My parents have argued, they've gotten into discussions, but at the end of the day, they're always laughing, they're always hugging, they were always very touchy-feely and like telling each other that they cared. And I think that that was a very valuable thing for my sister and I to grow up around. And it's just been great. It's been great getting to know them as mom and dad, but also getting to know them as people and what their interests were like, what their first dates were like, what their favorite childhood memories have been like. And so my parents have definitely shaped me, not only because they've been the ones taking us to Peru and back, but they've also been the ones who have given us our values, given us our ideas of what we like and what we don't like, and we've been able to dialogue about them. And so I think the fact that conversation has always been an important part of my family has really helped as well stress the importance of telling stories and telling your story and hearing other people's stories. English is actually my second language. So when I was born, my parents felt very strongly about the fact that I learned Spanish because they weren't sure at that time whether they would be moving back to Peru. And if they were, they wanted me to be able to blend in and to not stand out by having difficulties with the language. And so Spanish, until I was 3, the only thing that I really heard was Spanish. Like our TV shows were in Spanish. My nanny spoke Spanish. Our friends were all Spanish speakers. And so my mother, the quote that I have here for my thesis is something that my mother said, that she said that when we were in a park one day, I heard people speaking English, but I didn't realize that it was a different language. Like the concept of different languages just wasn't something that had ever occurred to me. So I thought that they were speaking funny Spanish. And she always told me that, and I thought that that was a very cute anecdote. But then when I became older and I started studying language and its impact in people's development, I realized that the idea of speaking just one language, and then all of a sudden overnight when you're put into a mainstream school having to deal with this second language that's completely different, that also has a very defining shape. It has a very defining impact on your life. And I say on the bottom, experience varies from person to person. The picture on the bottom is my sister and I when we were younger. And so my sister and I have had different experiences, and I think that they're both really fascinating because, like I said, I basically grew up speaking Spanish until I was 3. And then I went to school, and that's the first time I ever heard English. And then I was very shy. My mom says that I stopped talking, and the teachers thought that I had had some speech impediment, but it was just the fact that I didn't want to say anything until I fully understood what it was that I was trying to say. So I spent the whole year being very quiet. And then throughout my high school career and throughout college, I realized that I was always generally on the quieter side, especially in high school. And I'm not really sure how true it is, but I always feel like it has to do with the fact that the transition from Spanish to English must have done something. Because then I look at my sister, and I don't know if it's just a coincidence, but she, at least from my perspective, has always been very outgoing. Never had a problem speaking up in class from what I've heard. And she grew up as well speaking Spanish, but because she had me as an older sister, my friends would come over. And whenever my friends would come over, they didn't speak Spanish, so that we would speak English. And so my sister grew up hearing both languages in a more organic way. And I'm not sure whether that actually had an impact into why I'm a little more shy and introverted in the classroom than she is, but it's always been something that I've thought about. But the role of languages has always been really interesting. When you're raised between 2 different cultures, as I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, there can be a lot of clashes. So the quote on the top right is something my mother said to me once. She said that it was hard to raise me her way in the United States because the cultures are so different. The US has this very strong emphasis on be yourself, be independent, do whatever it is you want to do, like think about what's best for you, not in a negative way, but just it's very individualistic. Whereas Peru and a lot of, basically most of the majority of cultures in the world are not. They're very collectivist. So they're more family oriented. They're more, if you want to make a decision, that's fine, but what does the family think? Or you should run it by them, getting other people's opinions. So I think it's more of a collaborative system. And I've really enjoyed being able to get the best from both worlds, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been moments of tension here and there. For example, the idea of in the US, when you turn 18, you're supposed to leave home, go to college somewhere else, start establishing yourself. And a lot of times you're expected to not move back into your home. That's definitely changing nowadays with the economic regression that happened in 2008, I would say, but there's still more of an emphasis on establish yourself and get yourself going. Whereas in Peru, at least from what I've experienced, it's not necessarily like that. And so when I went to college, then I went to grad school. And then every time I would be home, when I was sort of in between stages in my life, I lived at home. And then before I purchased my apartment where I currently live, I decided to stay living at home with my parents for 2 years. And I think that that's the best thing that I've ever done, because it never felt strange to me, because that seemed so normal given my Peruvian side. And at the same time, it gave me 2 years where I could really see my parents every single day and strengthen those connections in a very different way than when I was younger, because even though they're still parents, it was more of an adult to adult relationship. And I feel like that's when my friendship aspect with my parents started developing. And those were like 2 of the best years of my entire life. As far as high school goes, I think the day in which things clicked for me was the day that I realized that shared experience is really important, because I had always heard people say, you know, Latinos are usually friends with other Latinos. African Americans are friends with African Americans, and you tend to group yourself in this case. But if you look at the picture, my best friends were not Latino. They were not, I couldn't really find what it is that we had in common. And then one day it hit me, and I was like, oh my goodness, like the 4 of us are, if not the oldest, we're one of the first people in our families to be born in the United States. And so even though my friends' parents came from very different countries and very different cultures, the 4 of us, even though we never actually spoke about this explicitly, I feel like that must have played a role in why the 4 of us got along. We knew what it was like to go to school in English and go home and speak a different language or hear a different language. We knew what it was like to have family live very far away. And I think that even, like I said, even though we never actually sat down to speak about this, I feel like it definitely must have played a role in helping us connect. And so it really showed me that shared experience comes in many different forms. But when you have that type of connection with somebody, you can really take that and use it as a foundation to create a very strong relationship. And so my parents, my mom especially, always dreamt of coming back to Peru to live here. But for various reasons, it just didn't happen. And so we would come back to Peru every year for Christmas. And this quote was one that when I interviewed my mom for my thesis, it was something that really stuck with me when she said, you know, we really wanted to go back to Peru, especially me, is what my mom had said. And so she said that she started telling her friends and her family here, we want to come back. And they were telling her, oh, you're crazy. Like, why do you want to come here? You have so much more opportunities there. And I think that even though I'm very grateful to have been raised where I was raised and how I was raised, I was always very aware that, at least for my mother, staying in the US was always more her putting my best interest and my sister's best interest in front of her personal preferences. And I think that that's just something that she never said to us. And even though she never said it to us, now looking back, it's something that I'm very grateful for, to have had that kind of connection and that kind of example where I say, well, sometimes I might want certain things, and it doesn't have to be as big as where you live, but sometimes in relationships, whether it's parent-child, siblings, teacher-student, whatever connection it is you have in your life, sometimes compromise is needed. And sometimes you put the other person first, sometimes you don't. But that negotiation and that balance is something that really stuck with me. So again, my sister and I, in terms of language, like I said, we had very different experiences. In terms of our career, I chose teaching. She has been very, very interested in animals since before she was 3. I think since before she could talk, she just knew she loved animals. And so I've always been very, almost in a way, jealous of the fact that she knew exactly what it was she wanted to do, whereas I felt like I was so interested in all these different things, but I had no idea how that would play out into a career. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I actually ended up in teaching, because my sister, from day one, has always said, I'm going to be a vet. And then last year she graduated, and she is officially now a veterinarian. Whereas I've always been like, I have no idea what I want to do. And I sort of just fell into what it is that I do. And so I think that having that experience and having those contrasting experiences has always been something that have taught me that things work differently for different people. But that's okay, because everyone moves at their own pace and everyone moves the way that they're supposed to move when they're supposed to do it. And then something that I realized growing up was that whenever I would try to prove that sometimes I would feel like I had to prove that I was Peruvian to my family here so that they wouldn't see me as different. And when I was in the US, I felt like I had to prove that I was American, even though I spoke Spanish, even though my parents ate different food, even though all these different things were happening. And people kept asking, well, what are you more of? Are you more American or are you more Peruvian? And I really struggled with that question until one day I realized, you don't really have to pick. You can be both. It just depends on the context. And so that realization, at least for me personally, was like a very huge weight lifted off of my shoulders, that I'm always going to be both. And sometimes if I'm in Peru and I'm speaking Spanish all the time, I'm probably going to feel a little bit more Peruvian. And if I'm in the US, I'm probably going to feel a little bit more American, but that doesn't make me less of the other, and that combination is something that's unique. And I think that especially for a lot of people in today's younger generations, this is becoming even more common. And so I think that if someone had told me when I was in high school or before, it's okay to be both and you don't have to pick, I think that would have been really impactful to me, because it would have changed the way that I looked at things. And I'm really happy that I came to that conclusion, but it's something that I tell my students from day one, because I want them to hopefully come to that conclusion a little bit before I did, because even if it's one day before I did, that's one day without that weight. And I feel like that makes a difference. And then my parents, like I said, did their best and did a very, very great job raising my sister and I, giving us values from both Peru while embracing values that the United States has. And I remember whenever we had problems, or I would say, oh, I don't know what to do because we're in Peru and we're only in Peru for 2 weeks and there's so many people to visit and I don't have enough time. My mom would say, well, that's a happy problem, because your problem is that you have too many people that want to see you, too many people you want to see. And that phrase, happy problems, is something that my mom has said throughout my entire life. And sometimes I would say, Mom, please never say that again, because everything can't be a happy problem. Some problems are actually just problems. But I think that she was right. Like the way that she raised us, she really taught us to look at problems and try to always see the positive in them. So whenever I find myself struggling with something, I'm like, well, is this a happy problem? Is there a way to fix this? Should I be this stressed? And I think that having the phrase happy problems, whether I like it or not, always be in the back of my head, has also just shaped the way that I see things. And I try to look at things as happy problems and not so much as problems in and of themselves. Education for my parents has always been very, very important. So these are the 3 schools that I've attended. My high school, Sidwell Friends in Washington, that's actually where I currently work. And so coming full circle, which again is Sankofa, in that way has always been, it's just been neat for me because I get to work with a lot of my former teachers. Swarthmore was the college that I went to. It was very similar in that it also stressed a lot of interpersonal, very strong emphasis on connecting, not just with students, not just with the material, but also with your professors. And that just continued on into my graduate school when I was at Harvard. And my parents, one thing that my father said to me once is that our education was essentially our inheritance, but it was more of, so thinking of education as a gift is something that certainly impacted my path into teaching. But I feel that whether you teach or whether you don't teach, if you view your education as a gift, it's, again, something you can harness and use it in whatever it is that you end up doing in the future. So again, this tension between being Peruvian and American was something very constant throughout my life. A lot of times when I was in college, I would talk to certain people, certain friends, and they're like, well, no, you're not Peruvian. You can't be Peruvian because you weren't born there. But then when I moved to Argentina, so after college, I went to Argentina where I did a Fulbright and I was teaching English there, and I lived in Argentina for 2 years. That was the first time in my life where people were telling me, well, no, you can't be American. You don't look American. Your name's not English. Like you speak Spanish perfectly. So it was just interesting being on the opposite side. But again, being able to realize that I can be both at the same time and redefine what it means to be American, redefine what it means to be Peruvian, like whether you're born there or whether you have the culture in you, those things have been things that have always stuck with me. And then I remember when I was 5 or 6, one day I got really frustrated. So I said, which is the quote on the bottom left, I said, Mom, what am I? And I was hoping that she would say, you're Peruvian or you're American. And I just didn't, I was so nervous about what she would say because so much of my identity, I felt, rested on her answer. And she really gave me the most perfect answer that I could have ever asked for. She said, sweetie, you're Camila. So just be the best Camila that you can be and don't worry about the rest. And I think that my parents raising us as individuals versus Peruvians or Americans, thinking of telling us that we should think of ourselves in terms of who we are and not what we are, was also something really impactful. And so this next slide are just a few moments that really have stood out to me in my life. The top left is my high school graduation, and that's the day that a lot of my family from Peru came. My grandfather also came. That's the last time he was in the United States. And that was a really special day for me. The bottom pictures, English was my favorite subject when I was in high school, but I was certainly not the best at it. And when I was a senior, I was in this one professor, Mr. Tonkin's class. He's the man on the bottom left, but he's the man with his wife right there. He was renowned for being a very difficult teacher. And what I'm holding to his left is the first A he ever gave me. And so when I started working at my high school again, he and I became friends. And so he's the first teacher that I ever had who became a genuine friend afterwards. He's also the first teacher that I ever had who I saw pass away. And so he will always be that to me. He'll always remind me of the importance of relationships and remind me that teachers, mentors, bosses, they can become more than just that. They can become genuine friends. The top right, again, is my dog. So when my dog passed away, that was very difficult for me. And then the bottom right is a cousin of mine who also passed away, unfortunately, in 2013. He was very young. And that really impacted me because I realized that the last time I had seen him when I left, I don't even think I had a chance to say goodbye to him. And I remember not thinking that that was a big deal because in my mind, it was more important to say goodbye to my grandparents or people who might not be there when I came back. I always assumed he would be there. And it was a very difficult lesson, but it taught me that you really do need to live each day to the fullest in whatever capacity that might mean for you. So he's always been a constant reminder to me of loving life, of doing your best, of treating people kindly, because he did all of these things every single day. And so I really don't think that a single day has gone by since he's passed away that I haven't thought about him in one way or another. And so it's always been a reminder. And perhaps most importantly, my mother, who earlier this year in January was diagnosed with leukemia. So this year has been, again, very difficult and it has been very trying. But throughout her whole illness, she was so positive and she was so strong. And she really showed me that doing your best and staying positive and fighting till the very end is one of the most valuable things you can do. She unfortunately passed away on Thanksgiving Day this year, so it's been almost a month. But she obviously is someone who I will think about every single day for the rest of my life. But more importantly, think about the things that she showed me, to think about things as happy problems, to always embrace yourself, whether it's something you know or you're not sure of, just to be true to yourself and just to always try to see the positive and to always try to laugh, because she was always playing pranks and joking around. And so these are lessons that, even though I feel like I'm angry because I feel like I lost her too soon, I hear her voice saying, no, sweetie, that's a happy problem because you miss me. And that means that you loved me. And that's a happy problem. And so it's not easy, but I'm trying as much as I can to think of this as something happy in whatever capacity that I can. So again, just to retrace how I got here to teaching, after Swarthmore, I applied for a grant and I ended up getting a Fulbright grant to teach in Argentina. And I was working mainly with adults, but one day one of my students had a friend who worked at a high school and they asked me if I would go teach high school students. And that day I realized, oh my gosh, this is what I love doing. So it was sort of like a coincidence that I just happened to stumble across these connections. And so when I came back home, I knew that I wanted to be in education. And so my parents said, well, try working in policy because you might like that side of it. So I did, but I realized that teaching, being in the classroom, really spoke more to me. But I think that it was important that my parents asked me to try policy because you should always try different aspects of whatever field you're interested in. When I was in college, I didn't know, like I said, I wasn't my sister. I didn't know what I wanted to study. So I basically just took any class that I thought sounded interesting. And I think that that's one of the best things that I could have done, because unless you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer where you have a very set curriculum, if you want to be more in humanities like me, or even in those careers when you have electives, I would say pick your electives based on whatever it is that you really like. Anything that you think will make you think is something you should take, because even if you don't use it directly in your life, you will always apply what you learn from that. And so that's something that I realized my major sort of declared itself. And then one day I looked and I was like, oh, I've taken a lot of psychology classes and a lot of English classes. So I think I'm going to be a psychology major and an English minor, just because that's what I had already done. So I would say, in as much as you can, depending on where it is that you're focusing, take whatever really speaks to you, regardless of what discipline it is, because you never know how it will impact what you do later on. And so back to the beginning, after grad school, I applied for one job, which is the job that I currently have teaching in my old high school. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend just applying for one thing, but I realized that I felt strongly that I only wanted to apply to jobs that I was seriously interested in. And I got lucky and I got the job. But I would say there's a fine balance between doing just things that you find interesting and taking risks that are too big. Like this one worked out well for me, but I would say just always be more aware of options. But as long as it's something that you really enjoy doing, I think it's something that you should do. And so that led to La Nueva Generación, which means the new generation. And that is the class that I teach. And so really quickly, the class that I teach is an advanced Spanish seminar, and it focuses a lot on identity in today's US. So the grammar classes usually focus more on Latin America and Spain. The new generation in this seminar, I'm supposed to teach something that I'm passionate about and that I'm knowledgeable on, and I've studied identity in the US, so that's what I teach. So the difference with a seminar versus a normal grammar class is that students are now at a level where they can learn something in Spanish versus learning actual grammar. For the first couple of years, it was a semester-long course that I had, but it's now been a class that I've taught as a full-year course. And each year, I change different things. Each year, I add different readings. I try to shift units, and I think that each year gets slightly better. And again, we are looking at the implications of history and culture in the present U.S., but the main goals for me are teaching students the power of empathy, to be more self-aware, to realize the power of stories and personal narratives, and to question themselves, like how well do they really know each other? How well do they really know themselves? And even though we're looking at very big issues, I'm focusing them all through personal narrative. In this class, I think the two most important things are trust. So I spend a lot of time, especially this year, maybe about 2 months, just building trust within the classroom because we talk about very difficult issues. Let me see if I can actually skip ahead. No. I'll get to that. So we talk about very difficult topics, and so having a strong sense of trust is really important. But also, participation in my class is worth 50% of their overall grade because I really want them to use the language and I really want them to process what it is that we're talking about. And so speaking, I think the 50% of the grade being based on participation is great for some of them and is really difficult for others, but I think it pushes all of them slightly out of their comfort zone while negotiating and while discussing very relevant issues in politics and in sociology that are relevant today in the US. And so I give them their final paper prompt the very first day of class. And again, it's the idea, it goes back to the idea that if you want to know others, you need to know and understand their stories. But in order to do that, you need to know and understand who you are. So these are the 3 questions they have to address in their final paper. And it's just something that I always remind them of within each unit. So I think that the fact that they have that prompt the very first day really helps them understand what my goals are with them. One of the first books that we read excerpts from, is called Cultures and Organizations, and it's a book that I read in grad school, but it's a very easy read, and so I would definitely recommend this as something for you to pick up. Yeah, he talks a lot about the difference between individualistic cultures like the US and collectivistic societies like Peru or like many other countries. And so for me, as growing up between 2 different cultures and identities when I was in grad school, I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I'd had this book a long time ago. So again, it is a graduate level book, but it's an easy read. So I would recommend reading it, skimming it. It does a really good job about breaking big issues down into smaller and reader-friendly chapters. And so it talks a lot about the fact that everyone's values really start in the home, what it is that your parents show you, what it is, what they expose you to, then you move on into a school and then later on into society in general. And so this is where I begin my seminar talking about those early experiences. So like I said, some of these topics are things that we talk about throughout the year. And a lot of these are very difficult to talk about in English, and we talk about them in Spanish, which for them is their second language. So I think that in and of itself is also a challenge. And what I basically do with them is I try to not tell them this is the answer, because a lot of these things don't have answers. If they did, we wouldn't be discussing them this long. But what I want them to focus on is not so much what do you think about these specific issues, but why do you think that way? Where are your ideas coming from? And why does the person next to you agree with you? Or why does the person on your other side disagree with you? And dialogue. So I try to get them to really dialogue and to speak to understand the other person and not to speak to just respond. And I think the only way to do that is to start slow. So like I said, we spend the first 2 months doing a lot of team building exercises and a lot of identity exercise and a lot of identity activities. And the real point, what I want to ask them is like, how well do you really know yourself and how well do you really know your classmates? Because a lot of them have been in school with these same students for 14 years, but they realize that they don't really know that much about them. So the two or I guess three activities that I begin every year with is the first one, I pair them up and I have them for 1 minute ask each other questions. And the only prompt is you're trying to get to the essence of your partner. And then afterward, we talk about like, what questions did you ask? Normally they say like, what's your favorite color? Or how many siblings do you have? But then I also say, what questions did you not ask? Like, did you ask the other person, what makes you cry? Did you ask the other person, what's the worst thing you've ever done? And so we talk about how in the US as a society, we're taught to not go too deep, too fast. And so then I have them focus on why, like, why do they think this is? And what do they think that we gain from having this type of cultural norm? And what do they think we lose by having this kind of cultural norm? And again, there's no right or wrong, but I do want them thinking. I want them actively questioning what it is, what limits they set for themselves and where they might come from. The second object is timelines. So I have them write about the 3 most important or impactful moments of their lives up until this point. And then we put them all on a massive timeline and we start seeing, everyone has to talk about their moments, and you start seeing how lives intersect. So on one specific day, I might have had the best day of my life, but my classmate over here, that same day was the day that their pet died. And so when I was really happy, they were really sad. And so I think it's a really great way to visualize how the same day can be experienced by different people in very different ways and how it's important to be aware of these things. And then I also have them bring in their most prized possessions, and they get to decide what that is. And then they have to explain to the class why that it's their most valuable possession. And so people have brought in things from bracelets that grandparents have given them, or they bring in the first book they read, or they bring in soccer gloves because they like that sport. So it's really interesting to see what people bring. And a lot of students, when they journal about this, talk about how what really stood out for them is not so much the object, but the story behind why that object was important. And the 3 quotes on the bottom are from my student work. They obviously wrote it in Spanish. I translated them back to English, but I have them journal almost every day, or at least every week, about something that we're doing in class, and I have them process these things. And so reading their journals is also something that has really helped me get to know them in a different way. And I would say if you have the time and patience to journal yourself, journal, because it's something that's really valuable. I talk about Sankofa a lot, and the fact that we as humans, we have a huge range of identifiers. So what's your sex? What's your gender? Who are your friends? What education level do you have? What's your sexual orientation? And how it's very difficult to be dominant in every single one of these. You do find people who are males, the cisgender, physically capable, white. Like, you do find these combinations, and you can be on the opposite end where you have you're in the minority of a lot of these groups. But for most people, you can't be dominant in every single one of your aspects, and you can't be minority in every single one of your aspects. So it's interesting to think of things as dominant versus minority, and not specifically as, let's say, white or non-white, or male and non-male. Because if you are dominant in one and minority in another, it really helps you realize both perspectives. And so we talk a lot about this in the class. My second rule, like I said, is to lead by example. So with the personal narratives, I give my narrative first. I tell them, it's okay if you're not sure about something, it's okay to say, I don't know. So a lot of times in class, they'll ask me something and I'll say, well, I don't know. It's okay to be vulnerable. I try to be vulnerable by opening up and telling them things that I sometimes don't tell other friends, or sometimes even my family. So my students know a lot of things about me that almost nobody else knows, because I try to lead by example and show them that I'm being vulnerable so that they can be vulnerable back. And in my classes, whether it's Spanish 1 or whether it's a seminar, I always tell them, we're a family, we're not a class. And so they think it's very cute, but I do think that it changes the way that they interact with each other. These are I'm going to go really quickly through these because I'm running out of time. These are the units that we look at in my class. And so I basically pick the units for the most part on how race and ethnicity is divided in the US on the census. And we talk about one thing within each of these groups. So with Latinos, we look at how they're portrayed in the media. But you can look at portrayals in the media of any of these groups and the intersection of these groups. So intersectionality is also really important. And I always ask them, whenever we're looking at Latinos, if you don't identify as Latino, still try to think of it as your story. Where do you see yourself in these narratives? Because you might not be Latino, but your group is portrayed in the media somehow. So where do you see yourself in these stories? And what does it mean if you really cannot relate to one of these groups? And so I just always have them question different things. This is, again, really quickly, one of the exercises that I do is I show them this Snapchat from 2012, I believe, and we talk about why it's funny, and we talk about why it's not funny, and then we talk about privileges. So like, what parts of yourself can you hide? And what parts of yourselves can you not hide? And so one of my students once said, well, I can't hide the fact that I have 2 arms and 2 legs. And we all thought that that was funny, but it's also a really good point, because I say, well, how often do you consciously think about the fact that you have 2 arms and 2 legs? And a lot of them say, well, almost never. And I say, well, if you didn't have 2 arms and 2 legs, how often would you think about that? And so we talk about how often do you think about what you can hide, what your privileges are, and how often do you think about the things that you lack? And then on the flip side, let's say you identify as bisexual or gay, and you live in a community that really does not accept those identities. Sure, you can hide that part of yourself, but is it really a privilege if you feel like you have to hide a very important part of your identity? So I try to get them to think of these things in different aspects. It's just one example of something that we do. And my third rule is to be open to change. And so the left side are quotations from my students' work in their journals, where they talk about seeing things from different perspectives. And sometimes they talk about things that are not easy for them. And then on the right-hand side, I picked quotations or quotes from their journals that talk about what it was like to discuss these very difficult conversations in their second languages. And I think that that's an extra layer that fascinates me personally, since I've been always very interested in languages and how you process and think in different cultures and in different situations. And so seeing my students process these things and be actively aware about how they're doing things in Spanish versus in English and vice versa has always been really eye-opening, not just for me, but for them as well. And so basically my point is to them, stories matter, because stories are how we have always connected. They force you to challenge what you think, because you're always redefining yourself and redefining somebody else in terms of your interactions. If I speak with somebody and they say, well, I think this, and I agree with them, it helps me redefine myself by saying, it validates what I've thought. But if they say something that I very much disagree with, it also helps, it forces me to redefine myself, because I have to question, why do I disagree with them? And what is it about our lives that have led us to have these very different viewpoints on this one issue? And so if you focus too much on the big picture, you could lose the stories. And if you focus too much on the individual, you can lose the big picture. So finding that balance is important. But I think a lot of times we forget to give stories, the individual stories, I'm not sure what the right word is, but we don't always give them the importance and the value that they deserve, because the smaller individual stories can really make a huge difference in how we process the bigger picture. A few recommendations that I have are TED Talks. These are some of my favorite books. Like I said, Cultures and Organizations, it's a great one. Another one that I read in grad school is called Real Leadership, and it was written by Dean Williams, and I was lucky enough to take one of his courses at the Kennedy School. And they're just, again, also a very easy read, but very, very thought-provoking and very eye-opening in terms of how you view what leadership means. And it gets back to the essence of connecting. It gets back to relationships. The Danger of a Single Story is a fantastic TED Talk that we watch in my class as well, that talks about what you cannot, it's impossible to know everything. So always try to speak to as many different people as you can, because only by speaking to different perspectives can you start to get more of a whole story. And then on the bottom right, The 21 Balloons, that's my favorite book in the entire world. And I read it when I was in 4th grade. So I would say, don't overlook your childhood stories, because a lot of times they will have lessons that you will realize you apply throughout your whole life. So don't be afraid to say that your favorite book is something that you read when you were 9 or 7. Whenever I'm sad, this is one of the books that I will pick up and just reread over and over and over again. And that's it. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any of them. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Camila. That was very informative, and it was really nice to learn about you and who you are as an individual. Before we see if we have any questions, I had a question, and I was thinking about how you were talking about identities and knowing who you are, and how you talked about the dominant and the minority aspect of your identity. So how does one get to identify who they really are and know what's their dominant aspect of their personality, if I can say that, or their minority
Yeah,
aspect?
I think it's a really great question, and it's something that my students and I myself struggle with, and I continue to struggle, because what I tell them is that identity is, it's not something that you just, it's not a fixed thing. So if today I realize that this is who I am, tomorrow it might be different. It's something that's constantly changing based on your experiences. And so I would say that I'm defining dominant within a specific society. So in the United States, for example, if you're speaking strictly about race, white would be the dominant group. Everybody else who's not white is considered some sort of minority. So you know whether you're white or you're not. And if you're white, you will most likely have a very different experience than somebody who's not white. But so in my class, I say, I'm not white, I'm a Latina. So I know what it's like to be a minority in terms of race. I'm a woman. The dominant group is normally male. So I know what it's like to be a minority in that case. But I've also been formally educated. Are you getting that? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. So I say, like, but I've also received formal education. So in terms of education, I'm in the dominant group. So I know what it's like to be on that side. And I'm physically capable. Like, I don't have any physical disabilities, at least not up till this point, thank God. And so I know what that's like. I don't have to worry about, can I climb stairs? And so I'm just trying to get my students to think of different aspects, because we tend to focus on where we're the minority, but a lot of times we're also the majority in other aspects. And so the sooner you can start recognizing both, the sooner you can sort of start piecing together who you are, and the sooner you can start relating to other people. I'm not sure if that answers your question, because I think it's tricky, because it can depend on where you are.
Okay, I think it does, and I can also relate to that, because I get to live those realities where you're talking about. As a race, I'm a minority in the U.S., and I'm sure if I travel back home, it will be different, because I'll be in a privileged state in that I've been formally educated too, and the majority of women are illiterate in my country, so I can totally relate to that. And as I wait for some more questions to come in, I was going to just go back to the fact that you mentioned about transnational lives, and I feel like that relates with identity too. And you spoke about how for you, being more American doesn't have to mean less Peruvian. So how do you achieve that kind of balance in your life where
I think, so I used to think of it like, let's say if this is a spectrum and this is American and this is Peruvian, I used to feel like I had to be somewhere. So if I was here, that meant I was this much Peruvian and this much American, or vice versa. And I always felt like it had to be a fixed thing. But I've realized, like, what I've come to realize is that I no longer try to be both or try to be neither. It's just, I sort of just go with the flow. And if I start thinking of identity as something that's fluid, I might be closer to here in this situation, but that doesn't make me any less of that. It just means that I'm relating more to my Peruvian side when I'm in Peru with my family, or I'm relating more to my American side when I'm teaching my students in Washington, D.C. But I think it's easier said than done, but I think, like, accepting that I can be both at the same time and I don't have to be qualifying which one I'm more of at a given moment was very, I would say, life-changing, but it was more like a very huge weight lifted off of my shoulders, because I stopped trying to focus more on what I was and started focusing more on just what I was experiencing and what I was feeling.
Okay, that's really great. And you did mention that you use some books in your classes, and we have a comment from Facebook from Jesus, and he wants to know if Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. My pronunciation is so wrong, I'm sure. But do you use that book in your class, or do you know it?
I do know that book, and I've read it, and I like it very much. I don't use it in my class, unfortunately, because, like I said, I teach Spanish, and so I'm trying to get Spanish resources. So that's, for me, that's been one of the biggest struggles, finding resources in Spanish. So every now and then, like with cultures and organizations, I will take like a small snippet in English and have them read it in English. Because I think that that's also a great exercise. Reading things in one language and then having to discuss and process it in a second language is a lot harder than it sounds. But one of my personal goals is to teach this seminar as an English class. And so if I teach it in English, then that Democracy in Education is definitely a book that I would work into the curriculum because I think it's extremely relevant. So it's definitely a very great resource that I would recommend.
Okay, thank you so much. And I was thinking about how you mentioned that one of your students had this moment where he wrote in his journal, he was talking about how using a different language made him conscious of what he really has to say.
Yes, I'm gonna go back to that slide.
In the blue, when he said when you're speaking in a foreign language, you're forced to be intimately aware of the word you choose. This forced me to be more thoughtful and think more deeply about what I was trying to articulate. And I can totally relate to that. And this made me think about how this is something you've been talking about, language as an identity. And I feel like, especially when you speak a foreign language here in the US, and it's actually hard for people to understand what you're saying. So what are your thoughts on language as an identity? And how can people embrace that aspect of themselves?
Again, I think it depends on their personal situations. A lot of people in today's generation grow up in bilingual or multilingual households, so it's not really a choice. But I think that obviously I'm very biased, but I think that studying languages is very important. And I tell my students that I think it's very important. They don't have to use Spanish. If they decide that they never want to speak Spanish again once they graduate high school, that's entirely their prerogative. But having taken a second language for 1 year, 2 years, 4 years or more, it changes the way you think. It changes the way you see things because you can't learn a language without learning about that language's culture. And I think that even if what they do in the future has nothing to do with Spanish, and even if it has nothing to do with other languages, they will be capable of analyzing situations in a different way from different perspectives because they were able to study a different language. And a lot of my students, like the quote that you pointed out, a lot of my students said that after taking a class like mine and a class like the other seminars that they teach at my school, because they don't want to offend anyone or because they don't want to say the wrong thing, they have to really, really think about exactly what they're going to say. And they've talked about how that has helped them process these issues in English. Like one of my students said, now whenever we talk about race or presidential elections or anything that's going on in the country, instead of just talking to talk, I really take the time to process what it is I want to say because I have that experience from doing it in Spanish. So I think that languages, again, I'm biased, are very important. And especially in the United States, languages are very important because they will open so many doors for you.
Yeah, thank you for that response. It's really interesting to think about it that way. And I think, as you're saying, I think the number of bilingual people is increasing by the day, if I could say that. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be interesting to see how that actually plays out even into the politics, because I know it's been an issue sometimes already. And please go.
I was going to say one thing that I do tell my students is, again, you might not be in a bilingual household, you might not be in a multicultural household, you might not relate to any of these experiences, but it's still your story because you're still part of a generation that is overwhelmingly multilingual and multicultural. So you need to know what that's like, So I try to show them that no matter what we're looking at, it's still part of their story because it's part of their generation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a very important aspect to think about everything that we see in the world, because it's almost as if one is saying that if you're not affected by something, if you're still affected by something, even if you're not part of it,
right?
If I could say that. And just to wind down, you did talk about how the norm here, especially in America, you have to be sort of politically correct, if I could say that, and not go too deep, too fast. So I know that's something you try to engage with in your classes. What is your advice for people outside the classroom? Because I think that would be a very good thing to have to do as well, where you can maybe talk about some of these things, have these meaningful conversations rather than just say, oh, what do you like? What do you like? But have meaningful conversations and bond with people and just allow them to be vulnerable with you as you are allowing yourself to be vulnerable with them.
So I would say my advice is to do that as much as you can, but it's also difficult because, like I said, in order to have these, the reason that my class works, whenever it works, is because I think I spend so much time doing those exercises in the beginning. So the fact that now my class is a full year instead of just one semester long has made a huge difference, because this year I think we spent about 2 months, maybe 3 months, just doing exercises and activities for them to get to know each other. Because if you don't create that level of comfort and that level of trust, it's less likely that they're going to want to say something potentially controversial. So I would say my advice is, whenever possible, just say what it is you genuinely think. But obviously, that's not always feasible, because you can't walk into a job and say, well, I think this about my boss or this about this person. But I would say, my advice would be not so much say what it is you think, but try to genuinely connect with people. So try to get to know your boss, not as your boss, but as who they are. Try to get to know your colleagues, not as another Spanish teacher, but as this person and what her interests are and what she likes to do. And try to, I think, because the more you get to humanize people, the easier it is to empathize with them, especially when they have a different opinion than yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I've really enjoyed this. And I don't think we have any more questions coming in. We're going to go to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so please feel free to reach Camila. That's her email. You can also follow her on Facebook, if that's okay with you. You can get in touch with her there.
That's fine.
Yeah, sorry for putting you on the spot.
My Facebook is not very interesting, but you're welcome to follow me if you would like.
Yes, but if you have something that you want to say to her, you can just send her an email at camila.m.villanueva@gmail.com. And please consider donating to Speak Mentorship. And thank you so much for joining us. And next month, we're going to be talking to Dr. Kristen Tsai, and she's going to be talking to us about an unofficial guide for getting into medical school. So if you're interested in getting into medical school and learning how that process is like, Dr. Kristen is the best person to talk to about that. Please join us next week. And thank you so much for everything. And it was really nice having you, Camila. I really enjoyed your talk that you had with us. And I'm pretty sure that everybody else who tuned in, I really enjoyed it too.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hoping to see you all next month.